On my birthday, my parents sent me a beautifully wrapped gift box, and I was about to tear the ribbon off when my husband stepped in front of me, his voice sharp and urgent as he said, "Don't open it. Can't you see it?" For a moment I thought he was joking, but the way his eyes darted around told me something was wrong. My heart sank, because his tone wasn't the playful kind I'd gotten used to. It was defensive, almost as if he'd been caught doing something. I froze, wondering what on earth could be inside a gift from my parents that would make him react like that. The tension between us had been building for months, especially since he'd started spending long hours at work and had become strangely protective of his phone. I had brushed off my suspicions as paranoia, but his sudden panic over a harmless-looking gift triggered something in me. I told him I would open it later, just to diffuse the moment, but deep down, I knew I had to see what was inside without him around. That night, when he left for another supposed late meeting, I opened the box and found an envelope on top of a neatly folded silk scarf. Inside the envelope was a note from my mother, written in her neat cursive, that said, "We thought you should know before it's too late." Beneath the scarf were printed photographs, my husband with another woman, the two of them laughing over coffee, holding hands, and even leaving what looked like a hotel together. My stomach dropped as I flipped through the stack, each picture a new punch to the gut. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the fact that my parents had known and had been quietly gathering proof. I sat there in silence for a long time, rage mixing with heartbreak, but instead of confronting him immediately, I decided to play this carefully. I was not going to let him walk away clean. The next day, I acted completely normal. I even thanked him for protecting me from a suspicious package, just to watch his expression tighten. In my mind, the revenge was already taking shape. I started documenting everything, every time he came home late, every unexplained expense, every interaction that seemed off. I also began reaching out to people who might have been in on his secret, including his co-workers, under the guise of planning a surprise party for him. It didn't take long before one of his less discreet colleagues let something slip about a work trip he'd taken alone with the woman in the photos. My anger deepened, but I kept my smile, because now I had a plan to hit him where it would hurt most, his career and his image. He worked in a position where reputation was everything, and any hint of scandal could ruin him. I made copies of the photos, saved screenshots of texts I managed to pull from his unlocked laptop, and put together a neat little file of evidence. At the same time, I began positioning myself as the wronged but composed wife in the eyes of his family and mutual friends, dropping subtle hints about how hard things had been without ever revealing the whole truth. I wanted them on my side before the storm broke. When I had enough evidence, I timed my move carefully. A week later, he was due to give a major presentation at work that would have put him in line for a big promotion. The night before, I sent an anonymous envelope to his boss containing the photos, a few selected text messages, and a short note that read, "Perhaps you should know who you're promoting." I sent a similar package to the woman's fiancé, whose contact details I'd found through a bit of social media digging. By the time my husband left for work that morning, still oblivious to what was coming, the dominoes were already falling. I waited until he was in the middle of his workday to send him a simple text, "I know everything. Don't bother coming home." Within hours, I heard from a mutual friend that he'd been pulled out of the conference room mid-presentation, his face pale and his hands shaking. He didn't call me, he must have known there was no point, but I saw the missed calls from his family, clearly confused and alarmed by whatever he'd told them. I stayed silent, letting the whispers and speculation grow. In the days that followed, the fallout was everything I had imagined and more. His promotion vanished overnight, the other woman's engagement was called off, and his carefully curated professional image was shredded. Friends who had once taken his side now quietly distanced themselves as the truth leaked out in bits and pieces. I filed for divorce almost immediately, using the evidence I'd collected to secure a very favorable settlement. He tried to play the victim at first, claiming I had overreacted, but when I calmly presented the timeline of his lies and the undeniable proof, even he had to admit he'd destroyed the marriage with his own actions. My parents, who had set this entire chain of events in motion by sending me that gift box, stood by me every step of the way, reminding me that sometimes the best revenge is to let people destroy themselves. You just need to hand them the match. By the time the dust settled, I had not only freed myself from a toxic marriage but also watched the man who thought he could betray me lose everything he'd built on lies. And as I stood in my own apartment months later, opening a small gift my parents had sent, just because, I couldn't help but smile, knowing that this time, there was nothing, and no one, to ruin it. That he tried to spin his own version of events to anyone who would listen, claiming I had been cold, distant, and that he had made a mistake out of loneliness, but the people who mattered weren't buying it. The photos, the timestamps, the texts, they told a story that didn't leave much room for excuses. What he hadn't counted on was the fact that his other woman had her own reputation to protect, and once her fiancé found out the truth, she turned on my husband instantly to save herself. I heard through a mutual contact that she had sent her own set of emails to his workplace, detailing how he had initiated everything and painting herself as the victim. It didn't matter to me whether she was lying to cover her tracks. What mattered was that she was now another nail in the coffin of his career. He'd been suspended indefinitely while they investigated, but everyone knew that was corporate code for, "You're finished." The man who had once bragged about his influence in the office now avoided public places, too afraid to face the whispers and stares. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding my own life, and I did it publicly enough that word would inevitably get back to him. I posted pictures of myself going out with friends, trying new hobbies, and even traveling, smiling in every shot, looking like I was living the life I deserved all along. It wasn't about making him jealous, it was about showing him, and everyone else, that I wasn't broken by what he did. That seemed to bother him more than anything, because a man like him thrived on control and the idea that I would be miserable without him. I wasn't. I had started to feel lighter, freer, and more certain of myself with every passing week. And the more he saw that, the more desperate his attempts to contact me became. He tried sending letters, apologizing and asking for a fresh start. He sent gifts, all of which I refused to open, leaving them stacked by the door until I eventually donated them without a second thought. Each unopened box felt like a small personal victory, a reminder that I didn't have to take back anything that came from him. His family reached out too, begging me to at least hear him out, but I told them the same thing I had told him: there's nothing left to say. He made his choices, and I made mine. That was the end of it. I cut contact completely, blocking him from every platform and changing my number so he could no longer find a way to reach me. It wasn't until months later that I learned just how much my quiet, methodical approach had destroyed him. A former co-worker of his, someone who had always been polite to me, reached out to say that he'd been blacklisted from his industry. Apparently, once word got out about the affair and the timing of his suspension, no one wanted to take the risk of hiring him. His savings had dwindled from legal fees and the cost of keeping up appearances, and the woman he'd thrown everything away for had cut ties the moment things turned ugly. By then, I had moved on to a new job in a healthier workplace, surrounded by people who respected me, and I had even started dating again, someone who treated me with the kind of honesty and care I should have had from the start. The irony wasn't lost on me that the man who once told me to stay out of things I didn't understand was now the one facing the consequences of things he could no longer control. My revenge had never been about shouting the truth from the rooftops, it was about planting the seeds quietly and letting the truth do the work. And it had worked perfectly. I hadn't just taken back my life, I'd made sure he couldn't use the same lies on anyone else. Every time I saw another unopened box or package in a store, I thought of that birthday gift from my parents, the one that started it all, and I felt nothing but gratitude. Without it, I might still be living in the dark, still trusting someone who didn't deserve it. Instead, I had the freedom, the clarity, and the satisfaction of knowing that my life had improved in every way, while his had unraveled completely. That he thought the worst had already passed, but I wasn't even close to finished. My revenge had been personal so far, but now it was time to make it professional and permanent. I still had contacts from when I used to help him with networking events, people in his industry who respected me because I'd always been the calm, polite one standing beside him. I started reaching out, casually asking if they'd heard about what happened. I didn't need to embellish, just a quiet, "Oh, I'm sure you've seen the news from his office," was enough to set the wheels turning. The thing about high-profile careers is that gossip moves faster than official memos, and soon he was a cautionary tale whispered about at lunches and late-night drinks. His name became shorthand for, "Don't mix business with pleasure," and that alone was enough to close doors before he even knocked. I didn't stop there. Remember the late-night meetings he'd claimed were so vital? I had a detailed timeline, receipts, and calendar entries proving otherwise. A discreet friend of mine who worked in HR consulting helped me put together a report highlighting his misuse of company resources, including expense accounts for trips that were very clearly not business-related. I sent it anonymously to the internal audit department of his company, along with the same evidence to a couple of industry watchdog groups who loved a good scandal. The fallout was swift. He was blacklisted not just informally, but on paper, his name flagged in systems that ensured he'd never get another position with a reputable firm. While all this was unfolding, I focused on my own career and relationships. I took on a new role where I was valued for my work, not overshadowed by someone else's drama. Colleagues respected me for my professionalism, and my new boss even encouraged me to share my ideas in leadership meetings, something my ex-husband had always subtly discouraged, as if my success would somehow threaten his. I realized just how much of myself I'd been shrinking to fit into his ego, and with every day that passed, I felt taller, freer, and sharper. My confidence came back in ways I didn't expect, how I spoke, how I carried myself, even the way I looked people in the eye. Then came the part one hadn't planned but fully enjoyed, his family turning on him. At first, they defended him blindly, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, but as more people started sharing bits of the truth and they saw how I was thriving without him, they quietly shifted their loyalty. His sister reached out one afternoon, apologizing for the way they'd treated me and admitting they'd heard from multiple sources what he'd been doing behind my back. Apparently, the other woman had started dating again and had been more than happy to tell her side of the story, painting him as a manipulative liar who had made her think he was already separated. The irony was delicious. The lies he told to protect himself were now dismantling him piece by piece. Every time I heard another update, I felt that same quiet satisfaction. This wasn't about screaming my truth or causing public scenes. It was about controlling the narrative and making sure his actions followed him for the rest of his career and social life. I'd planted every seed carefully, and now I was watching them grow exactly as I intended. And the best part? He still didn't know the full extent of what I'd done. He suspected, of course, men like him always do, but without proof, he could only stew in the knowledge that someone had outplayed him at his own game. That, more than anything, was my final twist of the knife. By the time 6 months had passed, he was out of work, single, and renting a tiny apartment in a part of town he used to mock for being beneath him. I, on the other hand, had just accepted a promotion that came with a relocation package and the kind of salary I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. Packing up my things, I found that silk scarf my parents had sent in that gift box. I folded it carefully into my suitcase, smiling to myself. It wasn't just fabric, it was the flag I'd carried into my quiet little war, and it had marked the moment I stopped being a victim and started being the architect of my own comeback. When I finally stepped into my new apartment in a different city, it felt like closing the last door on a chapter that had nearly destroyed me. The air felt lighter, the silence peaceful instead of tense, and for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone to come home and bring with them a storm. I unpacked slowly, savoring each moment, knowing every item I set down belonged to me alone. My phone buzzed with messages from friends I'd made since the divorce, people who knew me not as someone's wife, but as myself. I didn't tell them much about the old life, I didn't need to. The joy in my voice and the peace in my face said everything. A few weeks later, I got word from a former colleague of his that he tried to get a job out of desperation, even applying for roles far below his old position. No one bit. His reputation was so damaged that even companies willing to overlook a scandal didn't want the baggage he carried. Worse for him, his former friends had moved on, replacing him in every social circle that had once made him feel important. The woman he'd thrown everything away for had gotten engaged again, this time to someone in his old professional network, which meant he couldn't escape being reminded of his downfall. In some twisted way, it was almost poetic justice. He was living in the shadow of the very choices he'd made. For me, revenge had never been about watching him suffer endlessly. It was about ensuring he could never hurt me or anyone else the way he had. And I had done that. I'd taken back my dignity, my independence, and my voice. I didn't need to shout my story from rooftops. The right people already knew the truth, and the wrong people no longer had access to my life. That was power, the kind he could never take from me again. One evening, as I was walking home from work, I passed by a boutique and saw a gift box in the window, tied with the same kind of ribbon my parents had used. I stopped and stared for a moment, remembering how one package had flipped my entire world upside down. Back then, it had been the start of heartbreak and rage. Now, it was a reminder that sometimes the worst moments are just the first step toward your best ones. I walked inside and bought the box, not for anyone else, but for myself. Inside, I placed a letter I wrote in my own handwriting, not to my past self but to my present one. You survived. You rebuilt. You won. When I got home, I set it on the shelf where I could see it every day. It wasn't just a symbol of what I'd been through, it was proof that I could take the ugliest betrayal and turn it into the foundation for a life worth living. My parents' gift had revealed the truth, but my own choices had carved out my freedom. That was the real comeback, the real revenge, not just surviving what he did, but thriving in spite of it. And as for him, he had become exactly what he feared most, irrelevant. His absence didn't leave a hole in my life, it left space for better things to grow. And I intended to fill every inch of it.